there once was a professor who ran a photography class, and at the end of the semester, he split the class into two groups of students for their final project. The first group would be graded solely on the quantity of photos that they could produce, while the second group would be graded on the quality of a single photo that they would have to submit. And so he would grade the first group on how many photos they could submit regardless of the quality, and he would rate the second group based on whether or not they were able to produce the perfect photo. And at the end of the semester, what the professor realized was that the group that had produced the highest quantity of photos actually ended up producing the highest quality photos as well. Because while this group had been tasked with just coming up with as many photos as possible and taking as many as possible, the other group, which was focused on quality, ended up theorizing endlessly about what made a good photo, while the first group was experimenting and constantly taking new photos and learning new things and adjusting their approach. And ultimately, what the professor learned was that quality comes from quantity. Hi, my name's Matt. I'm a current strategy associate at Google and a former management consultant at BCG. Now, I work with a lot of students to help them with their consulting case interviews. And one of the most common questions that I get asked is, when should I start casing and how do I improve my casing as fast as I can? And today I'm going to share with you what I've learned from my own experience having done case interviews, as well as through my experience working with many, many students. Let's get right into it. So the first thing that most people need to understand is that casing is not purely about talent or how much business knowledge you have, but it's actually a lot about pattern recognition as well. And so I would argue like half of doing well in a case interview is being able to communicate effectively and recognize patterns. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, this means that when you see A, you know you need to do B. Or say when C comes up, you know that D is the logical next step. And so in an ideal state, basically you want to be able to recognize these cues, A and C, and know that B and D are coming next. And so an explicit example of this would be knowing that, okay, when the case prompt is being read to me, I should prepare some clarifying questions, or I should start thinking about some clarifying questions. Or, for example, if the interviewer gives me an exhibit, they show me a data set, then I should be automatically, one, talking aloud about my observations, but two, thinking about what some potential key insights might be next or potential analyses that I can conduct with this data. And so in addition to obviously learning the content and understanding what levers a business has to address different issues, it's also about just getting familiar with the process of casing and the flow of a case. And so while content can be addressed in the classroom and through textbooks, understanding the process and the flow of a case and being able to develop that pattern recognition so you're prepared and able to respond properly when it's a high pressure situation like an actual interview, that only comes through action. And so there's two components of this, but I would argue that most people aren't going to have as many issues with the content piece of it because there are a ton of resources out there and plenty of opportunities to take classes or to learn about business concepts. But when it comes to understanding the process and the flow of a case and getting comfortable with actually doing a case, this is where there is no substitute for taking action. And if you are someone who is just starting with casing, or maybe you've only just started to delve into the world of consulting interview prep, then I know what you're thinking. You're probably feeling a little bit intimidated, and maybe you haven't done your first case yet, but someone's pointed you towards some resources and you've been reading a little bit online about case interviews, what they are, etc. But the number one thing that is going to allow you to improve faster than 99% of people who are prepping on case interviews is ripping the Band-Aid off immediately before you even feel prepared. Because the reality is you're never going to feel fully prepared with the case interview, and the fastest way to get up to speed is to go for quantity in the beginning so that you can develop that quality later on. Because the ideal situation is that by the end of your prep, you're so familiar with the case interview and the flow of a case and how to communicate your ideas to interviewers that you're able to focus more on the actual content and your framework and all the bits and pieces of your recommendation that set your case apart from the last person. But we can't focus on that if we haven't nailed the process and the flow of a case yet. And so the number one thing for beginners, if you want to get good at casing, you have to rip the Band-Aid off sooner rather than later. Find someone that you know that you're close to, maybe it's a brother, sister, mom, dad even, or a close friend or roommate, and ask them to case you today. If you don't do it today, you're probably going to end up putting it off to next week or the week after that. And before you know it, application season has started and there's so much going on, and you end up applying and getting an interview, but then you don't feel prepared because you haven't prepped enough. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Now, if you're currently struggling or feeling a little bit overwhelmed or intimidated by case interview prep and just the entire process of going from zero to landing an offer at a top consulting firm, don't worry. I'm actually working on something in the background that's going to be really helpful for you. I can't say too much right now, but I'm excited to share more details later, so stay tuned. But anyways, the final thing I want to nail home on the topic of why it's so important to start now and actually take action and start casing rather than reading online or reading different resources about how to case is because we want to be doing active versus passive learning. Active learning is when you're actually doing something and you're getting live feedback because you're either failing or you're succeeding at something, and so your brain is subconsciously encoding those memories into your subconscious. And versus passive learning, which is when you're just reading something, and say you're reading a textbook about how to play basketball, for example, that doesn't mean that you're going to be like LeBron James and be able to suddenly play basketball just as well as an NBA player, right? Pro athletes are actually a great example of what we're trying to go for because they have the decision-making frameworks and the processes of their sport so embedded into their subconscious that they're not really thinking about, oh, let me make sure that my form when shooting a basketball is right. No, they're able to think about the higher level things like, okay, is it a good moment right now to actually take a shot? And similarly with the case interview, we want you to have the process and the flow down and the pattern recognition down so that you can focus more on the actual content that you're coming up with and able to come up with better ideas. But some of you are probably wondering right now, okay, you've explained why all of this is so important, but if it's so helpful, then why don't more people start prepping cases before they feel ready? Well, the number one thing is that most people are being hindered by their ego because deep down, there's a voice in your head that's telling you, I'm not ready. I don't want to look stupid. This is dumb. I'm going to look like a fool. I don't want to make an embarrassment of myself in front of my friend. Or even if you're by yourself, you're thinking that, I just need to finish reading Case Interview Secrets or Case in Point before I can try my first case, right? Like, I'm not ready yet. Stop. It doesn't matter if you finish the book or not. In fact, I would argue if you're able to do your first case before you finish the book, then when you go back to reading the book, you'll actually be able to connect the dots a little bit better and understand the concepts that these people are talking about. And so do not wait to finish whatever you're reading or finish going through whatever prep materials you're going through, because the reality is you're probably just making excuses. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. Matt, what are you talking about? You literally told us that it's important not to just do 100 cases if you're not improving on each case, right? Shouldn't we be going for quality cases over quantity? So instead of doing 100 cases, we should just do like 30 really good ones and improve each time. And yes, you're correct. The point that I'm trying to drive across is that if you're a beginner and you've never done a case before, or maybe you've only done 1 or 2 cases, and you're still feeling really intimidated by the case interview process, then what you actually need to do is you need to force yourself to, at least for the next couple weeks, focus on quantity, because that quantity is actually going to lead to quality. But again, the number one thing that's holding people back from starting and from getting the quantity in is probably their ego. And so if you can overcome this initial hurdle, because it's always hardest at the beginning, then you'll have no problem getting to that quality. And honestly, this is something that I wished that I had internalized sooner, because when I started prepping for cases, what I did before I did a single case was I made sure that I was reading all the materials, and I wanted to make sure that I had read every resource out there, because I thought that my casing would be better for some reason if I did all of that studying beforehand. But what actually ended up happening was that my improvement was actually much more influenced by how many cases I did practicing with other consultants, not how many hours I spent reading Case Interview Secrets or scrolling on Wall Street Oasis reading about top tips to nail the case interview or reading about consulting firms. And so if there's anything that you take away from this video, I want it to be that if you're feeling unprepared right now, just do it. There's no excuse. Literally just rip the Band-Aid off, because the sooner you do that, the better off you're going to be.